Close your eyes for a moment and picture a world without refrigeration, without global shipping networks, without instant communication. A world where flavor itself was worth more than gold. Imagine standing on the docks of Alexandria, the salt-tinged air thick with the scent of cinnamon from distant lands, pepper from the Malabar coast, and the mysterious fragrance of frankincense carried on desert winds. This was the reality for ancient Roman spice importers, men who risked everything to bring these precious commodities across thousands of miles of treacherous terrain and unpredictable seas. Their story is one of breathtaking courage, cunning negotiation, and the relentless pursuit of luxury in an era where a single shipload of spices could make you unimaginably wealthy, or leave you penniless and forgotten at the edge of the known world. What if you could step into their sandals? What if you could feel the weight of that responsibility, the thrill of uncovering new sources of saffron or ginger, the constant threat of pirates, storms, and rival traders? This wasn't just a business. It was a high-stakes adventure that demanded equal parts bravery, intelligence, and sheer luck. The Roman demand for spices wasn't merely about seasoning food. It was about status, medicine, religion, and the very essence of what it meant to live well in an empire that stretched from misty Britannia to sun-scorched Arabia. Spices were symbols of power, mystique, and connection to realms beyond ordinary comprehension. In this video, we're going to journey back in time together, not as passive observers but as active participants in this dangerous yet thrilling trade. You'll discover what it truly took to succeed as a spice importer in ancient Rome, the networks you had to build, the risks you had to calculate, and the moments of sheer brilliance or desperation that defined your legacy. We'll explore the exotic markets, the hidden routes, and the untold stories of those who shaped history one spice shipment at a time. So settle in, because you're about to embark on an unforgettable adventure into the heart of one of history's most fascinating and perilous professions. To grasp the sheer scale of this operation, you must first understand that the Roman spice network was the ancient world's equivalent of the internet, a vast, interconnected web of information, goods, and people that pulsed with life across 3 continents. This wasn't a single road or a handful of ships. It was a sprawling empire of flavor, a logistical marvel that stretched from the misty pepper groves of southern India all the way to the damp, northernmost outposts of Britain. At its height, this network was the lifeblood of Roman commerce and culture, fueled by an insatiable appetite for the exotic. The value of these commodities is almost impossible to overstate. A single pound of first-quality ginger could fetch the equivalent of a laborer's yearly wage. A modest bag of precious long pepper, known as piper longum, was worth more than a healthy ox. And the most sought-after spices, like the incredible malabathron from the Himalayan foothills, were literally worth their weight in silver. This created an economy where a merchant's fortune could be made or lost on the success of one caravan, one ship crossing the Indian Ocean during the monsoon winds. The markups were astronomical. A spice could increase in value by 10,000% from its source in India to its final sale on the Palatine Hill in Rome. This wasn't mere trade, it was alchemy. Men were not just becoming wealthy, they were building dynasties, influencing senators, and funding legions, all on the back of a peppercorn. This immense flow of wealth fundamentally shaped the empire itself. The taxes levied on imported spices at ports like Alexandria and Myos Hormos filled the imperial coffers, paying for the aqueducts, the roads, and the armies that secured the borders. The quest for spices drove exploration and expansion, creating alliances with distant kingdoms and sparking conflicts with rival powers like the Parthians, who controlled the overland Silk Road routes. The Roman appetite for flavor didn't just build personal fortunes. It built and sustained an entire civilization, knitting together the known world in a relentless pursuit of sensory pleasure and social status. Every time a Roman aristocrat seasoned his meal with a sprinkle of imported pepper, he was participating in the most ambitious economic enterprise the ancient world had ever seen. Stepping into this world of unimaginable reward required an equally staggering upfront investment. This wasn't a profession for the hopeful dreamer with a modest savings. It was the domain of the already wealthy, the well-connected patrician, or the brilliantly successful freedman who had painstakingly built his fortune over decades. Your first and most monumental expense would be the ship itself. We're not talking about a small fishing vessel or a river barge. You needed a massive ocean-going merchant ship, a corbeta, capable of surviving the brutal monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean and carrying a cargo precious enough to buy a small city. The construction of such a vessel from seasoned cedar and oak, properly caulked and fitted with the strongest sails, represented a fortune all on its own. And one ship was never enough. The shrewdest importers always financed a small fleet, knowing that the loss of a single vessel to a storm or pirates would be catastrophic if it represented their entire operation. Spreading the risk across multiple ships was the only way to ensure that one disaster didn't end your career before it began. But a ship is just a hollow wooden shell without a crew to give it life. Your next massive financial drain would be hiring and provisioning the men who would undertake this perilous year-long journey. You needed a seasoned captain, a magister navis, who could raid the stars and negotiate with foreign merchants. You needed a crew of experienced sailors who wouldn't panic when the waves towered over the deck. And critically, you needed a sizable unit of private security, highly trained, well-armed mercenaries. Their sole job was to protect your floating treasure chest from the ever-present threat of pirates who stalked the trade routes from the Red Sea to the Indian coast. These weren't casual hires. You were paying a premium for men willing to stare down death for months on end. Their wages, along with the food, fresh water, and wine needed to sustain the entire crew for the duration of the voyage, added another immense layer of cost before a single peppercorn had even been purchased. Then came the hidden, often most frustrating, expense, dealing with the Roman bureaucracy. To even think of docking at the port of Myos Hormos on the Red Sea, you needed a mountain of official permits and licenses. Every level of the Roman administrative machine, from the local port prefect to the imperial procurators, expected their palm to be greased. There were taxes for the right to trade, taxes on the tonnage of your ship, and special gifts required to ensure your paperwork wasn't mysteriously delayed until after the sailing season had ended. The most critical permit was the aurum tyrannicum, a special tax that essentially served as your license to engage in international commerce. Securing all of this required either having powerful friends in high places or retaining the services of a well-connected middleman, a negotiator, who knew exactly which officials to bribe and how much to offer. This web of graft and official extortion could drain a treasury as quickly as any storm. With your ship secured, your crew hired, and your permits painfully acquired, your most critical decision now lay before you. Which path would you dare to take to reach the source of the spices? This single choice, more than any other, would determine your fate. The ancient world offered two primary arteries for this trade, and each was a world of its own, filled with unique perils and promises. The first option, the more traditional Mediterranean coastal route, was older and perhaps felt safer to the cautious soul. This path was a long, slow crawl along the northern coast of Africa, a series of hops from port to port. You would set sail from Ostia, the port of Rome, and meticulously work your way east, stopping at hubs like Carthage, Leptis Magna, and the great city of Alexandria. The primary advantage here was familiarity. You were rarely far from a friendly Roman port or a client kingdom, ensuring easier access to supplies, repairs, and imperial protection for much of the journey. The risks on this route were more predictable: the fickle winds of the Mediterranean, the threat of local bandits in less patrolled territories, and the constant grinding cost of harbor fees and tariffs at every single stop. The profit margins were slimmer because the spices you bought in Alexandria had already passed through countless other merchants' hands, each taking their cut long before they reached you. This was the route for the conservative trader, the one who prioritized a measured, consistent return over the chance of a legendary windfall. But for those with a true adventurer's spirit, the one who heard the call of unimaginable riches, there was only one real choice: the Red Sea route to India. This was the ancient equivalent of aiming for the stars. It was brutally direct, profoundly dangerous, and offered rewards so vast they could rewrite your family's history for generations. The journey began with a difficult overland trek from the Nile Valley across the desert to ports like Berenice or Myos Hormuz on the Red Sea coast. There, your ship would catch the miraculous Hippalus wind, the predictable summer monsoon that could blow a vessel straight across the open ocean to the Malabar coast of India in just under 40 days. This direct crossing was the masterstroke of Roman navigation, cutting months off the journey and allowing merchants to deal directly with Indian suppliers at the source. The rewards were frankly obscene. By cutting out every middleman, you could acquire pepper, ginger, and cinnamon at a fraction of the cost, creating those legendary 10,000% markups upon your return. But the risks were equally monumental. You were committing your ship and your life to the open ocean, far from any hope of rescue if the monsoon proved too fierce or your navigation was off by even a degree. The southern reaches of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean were hunting grounds for sophisticated pirate fleets who knew these ships were floating treasure chests. And then there was the market itself. You would be dealing directly with Tamil and Arab merchants in bustling Indian ports like Muziris, a place of bewildering languages, alien customs, and complex trade agreements that had to be negotiated without the safety net of Roman law. Choosing the Red Sea route was a declaration that you were all in, betting your entire fortune on your captain's skill, your crew's courage, and the favor of the winds themselves. It was the ultimate high-stakes gamble, separating the mere merchants from the legends of the spice trade. With your route chosen and your ship waiting, your next and perhaps most human challenge was assembling the crew that would transform this wooden vessel into a functioning, trading, and hopefully surviving enterprise. This was not a matter of hiring a few strong backs. You were hand-picking a small, specialized army of experts, each a master of their own critical domain. The wrong choice in any single role could mean the difference between a triumphant return and vanishing without a trace into the endless blue. At the absolute top of your hiring list was the navigator, the gubernator. This man was the intellectual heart of your voyage, a living library of celestial knowledge and weather patterns. He wasn't just a sailor, he was a scientist and a mystic rolled into one. His tools were the stars, the flight patterns of birds, the color of the water, and the subtle shifts in the wind. He needed to understand the complex cycle of the monsoon winds intimately, knowing exactly when to catch the perilous wind for the outward journey and when it would reverse to bring you home. A skilled navigator could shave weeks off your travel time, avoid treacherous reefs, and find his way across featureless ocean with little more than the North Star and his own accumulated wisdom. His fee was exorbitant, but he was quite literally your guiding light, the one person on board whose expertise could not be bargained for. Equally vital was your detachment of armed guards, your private security force. A ship laden with spices was a beacon for every pirate from the Red Sea to the Indian coast. These were not simple thugs with clubs. You needed professional, disciplined mercenaries, often retired legionaries or men from warrior cultures known for their seafaring prowess. They were equipped with the best weapons you could afford: short swords, shields, and javelins, and they trained relentlessly to defend the deck in a boarding action. Their presence was a powerful deterrent, but their value went beyond combat. In foreign ports, they provided a visible show of force during negotiations, protecting you and your precious cargo of silver and gold from local thieves. They were the iron fist inside your velvet glove of commerce, the necessary expenditure that made all your other investments secure. Then came your cultural and linguistic key to the entire operation, the translator and trade liaison. This individual was perhaps the most unique and hard-to-find member of your team. You needed someone who not only spoke Koine Greek or Latin, but also had a working knowledge of Tamil, Sabaean, or other local dialects you would encounter. But language was just the beginning. This person had to be steeped in the intricate social customs and unspoken rules of foreign markets. They knew how to properly greet a Tamil chieftain, what gifts were considered appropriate, and how to interpret the subtle nuances in a negotiation that could mean the difference between a fair deal and a disastrous one. A clumsy cultural misstep could offend a potential partner and close off an entire network of suppliers. Your translator was your diplomat, your cultural shield, and your most sensitive instrument for gauging trust in a world where a handshake was the only contract you could rely on. Finally, you needed your own trusted merchant, a man with a sharp eye for quality and an even sharper mind for numbers. While you might lead the venture, you couldn't be everywhere at once. This deputy was your proxy on the bustling docks of Muziris, personally inspecting every sack of peppercorns for moisture or mold, testing the purity of cinnamon sticks, and haggling relentlessly over prices. He had to possess an almost supernatural ability to assess value, to know the true worth of a spice in Rome versus its asking price in India, calculating the potential profit margin in his head amidst the chaotic noise of the market. His integrity was paramount, as the temptation to skim from the top or accept a bribe from a rival importer was ever present. This was the man who executed your strategy on the ground, turning your silver into the physical treasures that would define your success or failure. Together, this diverse team of specialists formed a single, intricate machine, each cog essential to turning your ambitious dream into a tangible and immensely valuable reality. Even with the best ship and the most skilled crew, your journey was a relentless dance with death, a constant reminder that the sea offered no rewards without first demanding its share of terror. The moment your vessel left the sight of land, you were at the mercy of forces so powerful they could erase your existence in an instant. The most feared of all was the storm. Ancient mariners didn't have satellite forecasts or radar. They relied on the color of the sky and the ache in an old sailor's bones. A sudden squall in the Mediterranean could whip the sea into a frenzy, but it was the monsoons of the Indian Ocean that truly held the power of life and death. These weren't mere storms. They were biblical events, The very same perilous wind that was your engine to India could, if your timing was wrong, transform into a raging monster. Waves the height of temples would crash over the deck, snapping masts like twigs and sweeping men and cargo into the abyss. The ship would groan and shudder, taking on water faster than the crew could bail. In those moments, all the wealth in the world meant nothing. Your entire fortune, your dreams of legacy, were reduced to a fragile wooden shell battling for one more minute of life against an utterly indifferent ocean. A single storm could, and often did, end countless stories before they ever reached their first chapter. If the sea itself didn't claim you, there was an ever-present danger that moved with intelligent, predatory intent: pirates. These were not the romanticized rogues of later tales. They were highly organized, ruthless businessmen of plunder. From the cunning lembo skiffs of the Cilicians in the Mediterranean to the formidable dhows of the Arabs and Somalis in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, pirate fleets patrolled the trade lanes like wolves. They knew the schedules, they knew the routes, and they knew exactly which ships carried the most valuable cargo. Their tactics were brutal and efficient. They would often lie in wait near narrow straits or secluded islands, using their faster, more maneuverable vessels to swarm a lumbering merchantman. A boarding action was a scene from a nightmare, a violent chaos of hooks, blades, and screams. The outcome was rarely a fight to the death. Your guards would only battle as long as honor demanded. Once it was clear the ship was lost, the goal was survival. Pirates were primarily interested in the cargo and the ship itself. They would typically ransom the wealthy importer and his senior crew back to their families for a hefty price. While this meant you might live to see another day, it was a financial catastrophe. You would return home not as a conquering hero, but as a bankrupted man who had to explain to his investors how he lost everything to a band of sea-going thieves. Surviving both the weather and the pirates did not guarantee success, for the sea hid quieter, more insidious threats beneath its surface. The entire coastline was a graveyard of ships torn apart by hidden reefs and jagged rocks, especially near unfamiliar shores. A navigator's error of a few degrees, a sudden fog, or a contrary current could put your vessel onto a razor-sharp coral reef that would gut the hull in seconds. A shipwreck in antiquity was almost always a death sentence. Even if you managed to get to a lifeboat, you were adrift in a vast expanse of water with limited supplies, hoping to be found by friendly fishermen instead of another pirate crew. And if you did make it to a remote shore, you then faced potential hostility from local tribes who might see you not as a guest, but as an intruder or an opportunity for enslavement. The sea gave no second chances. Perhaps the most demoralizing danger of all was the one you carried with you: disease. A merchant ship was a floating petri dish of misery. Cramped conditions, limited rations of stale water and hardtack, and a complete lack of hygiene created the perfect environment for illness to spread. Dysentery, known as the bloody flux, could rip through a crew, weakening men until they were too frail to handle the sails. Scurvy, though not yet understood, was a constant specter on long voyages, rotting gums and sapping strength from the lack of fresh fruit and vegetables. A fever could start with one man coughing in the hold, and within weeks claim half your complement, leaving you with too few hands to man the ship effectively. There were no doctors, only rudimentary medicine, and often no choice but to toss the dead overboard to prevent further contagion. Watching your investment, your highly paid, expertly trained crew, succumb one by one to an invisible enemy was a slow, helpless form of financial and human ruin. You could have a perfect ship a flawless route, and a hold full of silver, but none of it mattered if your men were dying around you, leaving your vessel a ghost ship adrift on a silent, uncaring sea. And so, after surviving the sea's countless dangers, you finally arrive at your destination, but your greatest test is not the waves or the wind. It is the man standing across from you. For many Roman spice importers, that man was an Arabian trader, a master of commerce who controlled the critical land routes from the Indian Ocean ports to the Mediterranean. These were not simple merchants. They were the gatekeepers of luxury, and dealing with them was a high-stakes game of wits, patience, and perception. They held all the advantages, possessing generations of knowledge about the sources, quality, and true value of the goods you so desperately wanted. Your success now hinged on your ability to navigate a human landscape more complex and unpredictable than any ocean. The first rule of engagement was understanding that you were always at an informational disadvantage. The Arabian traders, particularly the Nabateans and later the Himyarites, had spent centuries building a near monopoly on the flow of spices from the east. They knew the harvest yields in India, the political stability of source regions, and the exact prices being paid in Alexandria. You, having been at sea for months, arrived with outdated information and a pressing need to turn your silver into cargo before the sailing season ended. They would expertly exploit this time pressure. A master negotiator would begin not with prices, but with a prolonged ritual of hospitality, sharing coffee, dates, and conversation about everything except business. This was a deliberate tactic to gauge your character, your patience, and most importantly, your desperation. Rushing the process was the surest way to signal your vulnerability and guarantee you would pay a premium for every single peppercorn. To avoid being utterly cheated, you had to become a master of quality assessment yourself. The most common trick was adulteration, mixing high-value spices with cheaper look-alikes, or adding weight through moisture, dust, or even lead shot hidden at the bottom of sacks. A savvy Roman importer never took a sample from the top of a proffered bag. He would demand the right to inspect the entire lot, plunging his hand deep into the container to feel for dampness or foreign objects. He would crush peppercorns between his fingers to test for brittleness, smell saffron threads for freshness, and even taste a tiny amount of ginger to assess its potency. This theatrical inspection was a crucial part of the dance. It communicated that you were not a novice to be fooled, that you understood the nuances of quality, and that you were willing to walk away from a bad deal. Your translator and merchant were your eyes and ears during this process. Their ability to pick up on subtle cues and whispered asides, often meaning the difference between a fair transaction and financial ruin. The art of the deal itself was a slow, deliberate ritual of proposal and counter-proposal, never conducted with outright hostility, but with a veneer of mutual respect that thinly veiled a fierce battle of wills. The initial price quoted was always astronomical, a starting point meant to anchor the negotiation high. The counter-offer had to be insultingly low, but not so low as to cause offense and end the discussion. The key was to argue from a position of knowledge, not desire. You couldn't simply say, "I want it for less." You had to cite specific reasons, pointing out a slight discoloration in the batch, mentioning rumors of a large caravan arriving soon that would depress prices, or noting the approaching end of the sailing season that put pressure on them to liquidate their inventory. This shifted the dynamic from a simple transaction to a battle of strategic bluffs. The goal was to reach a price that felt like a painful compromise for both parties, a sure sign you had likely reached the true market value. Ultimately, The most valuable currency in these negotiations was not silver, but relationships. The shrewdest Roman importers understood that this was not a one-time transaction, but the beginning of a long-term partnership. Overpaying slightly on a first deal to secure the trust of a reliable Arabian house could pay massive dividends for years to come. That trusted partner might later give you early warning of a coming shortage, offer you first pick of the highest quality new harvest, or even extend you credit for your next voyage. In the shadowy, rumor-filled world of the spice trade, a reputation for fairness and honesty was an asset more valuable than any single shipment. It was the invisible network that truly fueled the empire's hunger for flavor, built not on contracts, but on the fragile, enduring bond of a handshake between two men from different worlds, each recognizing in the other a shared hunger for greatness. After months of battling the sea, the sight of the Malabar coast was nothing short of miraculous. Lush, emerald green land rose from the turquoise water, and the air itself changed, becoming thick with the humid, intoxicating scent of blooming flowers, wood smoke, and most importantly, spices. Your destination, the legendary port of Muziris, was not a city of stone like Rome, but a vibrant, chaotic symphony of life built from wood, woven palm fronds, and teeming humanity. As your ship navigated the final stretch of river, the sounds washed over you, a cacophony of a dozen different languages shouted over the din of hammers repairing ships, the bleating of animals being unloaded, and the constant rhythm of drums from a nearby temple. The docks were a forest of masts, from elegant Roman corbetta like your own to the sleek, enigmatic dhows of Arab traders, and the colorful, outrigger canoes of local fishermen. This was the epicenter of the global spice trade, a place where East truly met West, and your journey was far from over. Stepping onto the weathered planks of the dock, you were immediately engulfed in a sensory overload that Rome could never prepare you for. The colorful silks of Tamil merchants fluttered in the breeze next to the practical woolen tunics of Roman sailors. The market stalls were a breathtaking spectacle of abundance. Great mountains of black peppercorns spilled from open sacks like granules of black gold, while nearby, workers carefully weighed out delicate bundles of saffron threads, each one worth a small fortune. You'd see fragrant stacks of cinnamon bark, fiery dried ginger roots, and the mysterious teakwood boxes containing spikenard and malabathrin. But it wasn't just the spices. This was a market of the world's wonders. Ivory tusks from Africa, Chinese silks, pearls from the Persian Gulf, and exotic animals like parrots and peacocks in bamboo cages. Every sense was assailed at once, a glorious, overwhelming confirmation that you had, against all odds, reached the source. The real challenge, however, began the moment you sought to move from admiration to acquisition. Dealing with the local Tamil merchants and chieftains required a complete recalibration of everything you knew about business. Roman contracts and legalities were meaningless here. Commerce was governed by a complex web of reputation, ritual, and royal favor. Your first and most critical stop was not the market, but the audience hall of the local Chera chieftain or a powerful merchant guild leader. This was a formal diplomatic engagement, not a simple trade meeting. You arrived with gifts, fine Roman glassware, Italian wine, or silver coinage, to honor his status and secure his permission to trade in his domain. Failure to observe this protocol could see your entire operation frozen before it began, your goods impounded, and your crew confined to the ship. Negotiating with the Tamil spice merchants themselves was a masterclass in subtlety and patience. These were not desperate villagers. They were sophisticated, savvy businessmen who understood their products were the most desired commodities on earth. They knew the Romans' dependence on the monsoon winds created a hard deadline, and they used that time pressure with brilliant precision. A merchant might invite you to his compound, serving you sweet, spiced tea while engaging in hours of pleasant conversation about your journey, the health of the emperor, and politics in Rome, anything but the price of pepper. This was a test. To show impatience was to show weakness, and weakness was instantly exploited. The initial price quoted was always a fantasy, a starting point for a long, intricate dance of offer and counter-offer. Your own expertise was your only shield against deception. A merchant might offer a sack of pristine peppercorns on top, only for the middle of the bag to be filled with inferior quality or even pebbles to add weight. You had to insist on inspecting multiple sacks from the bottom of the pile, rubbing the peppercorns between your fingers to check for dryness, and even tasting a few to gauge their pungency. For cinnamon, you learned to check the thickness and aroma of the bark, knowing that the inner layers held the most potent flavor. Your translator was your most vital asset during these exchanges, not just converting words but interpreting tone, posture, and the subtle nuances that could make or break a multi-million sesterces deal. A successful negotiation ended not with a signed parchment, but with a handshake and a shared meal, cementing a relationship that you hoped would ensure priority treatment on your next perilous voyage across the ocean. In Musaris, you weren't just buying spices. You were investing in a human connection that spanned continents, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared understanding of the immense value and price of flavor. Of all the treasures that filled your ship's hold, none held more universal value or relentless demand than black pepper. This humble drupe, the dried berry of the Piper nigrum vine, was the absolute cornerstone of the entire Roman spice trade, the engine of your fortune, and the single most powerful reason you had risked this perilous journey. To understand pepper is to understand the very heartbeat of Roman commerce and culture. Its journey from a shaded plantation in the Malabar Hills to a Roman aristocrat's table was a marvel of ancient agriculture and logistics, a story of soil, sun, and shrewd human negotiation. The pepper you sought grew in a very specific and magical part of the world, the lush, humid western coast of southern India, a region known as the Malabar Coast. Here, the Piper nigrum vine thrived under the careful stewardship of local farmers who possessed generations of inherited knowledge. They cultivated the vines on living trellises, often training them to grow up the sturdy trunks of betel nut or mango trees, which provided the perfect dappled shade the plant craved. This was not a crop of vast, open fields, but of intricate, forest-like gardens where agriculture and nature existed in a delicate, symbiotic balance. The farmers nurtured these vines for years before they produced a viable harvest, protecting them from torrential monsoon rains and intense heat with an almost devotional care. The pepper berries themselves grew in dense, hanging clusters known as spikes, each holding dozens of individual drupes. They started a vibrant green, slowly ripening to a yellow-orange, and finally to a bright, warning red when they were ready for harvest. The entire process was a testament to patience, a quality you yourself had to learn when dealing with the men who grew it. Harvesting this black gold was a race against time and required an expert eye. Pick the berries too early, and they would lack the complex, fiery potency the Romans craved. Too late, and they would become overripe and lose their signature bite. The local harvesters, moving with practiced efficiency through the groves, would carefully cut the entire spike from the vine just as the first berries in a cluster began to turn from green to red. This was the optimal moment, capturing the full spectrum of flavor within each berry, The real magic, the transformation that created the iconic black peppercorn, happened next. The spikes were spread out on large mats under the blazing Indian sun. As they dried over several days, the fruits would ferment slightly and then shrivel, their outer flesh turning dark brown and then black, hardening into the familiar wrinkled sphere. This simple sun-drying process was alchemy, concentrating the piperine compound that gave pepper its heat and locking in the aromatic oils that provided its deep, woody, and complex flavor profile. This was the form in which you would buy it: hard, black, and incredibly lightweight, allowing a fortune to be packed into the hold of a single ship. But why was this particular spice worth more than a soldier's annual salary? Its value was a powerful combination of practicality, prestige, and perceived power. On a fundamental level, pepper was a phenomenal preservative. In a world without refrigeration, its antimicrobial properties helped mask the taste of slightly spoiled meat, nd Chinese letter ed spoilage, making it a critical tool in the Roman kitchen. Yet its use went far beyond the practical. Possessing and liberally using pepper was the ultimate status symbol. A wealthy Roman host would proudly display a silver or gold pipertorium, a specialized pepper pot, on his dining table, using it to generously season his food in front of his guests. This was a blatant, aromatic display of wealth and worldliness, a signal that the host possessed the means and connections to acquire the finest luxuries from the very edge of the known world. It shouted, "I have access to wonders you cannot even imagine." Furthermore, pepper was deeply embedded in the Roman worldview of wellness. Physicians from Galen onward prescribed it for a staggering array of ailments, from fevers and digestive troubles to asthma, and most famously, as a potent aphrodisiac. It was considered a hot spice that could balance the body's humors, stimulate circulation, and revive the spirit. This medicinal belief added another layer of indispensable value, making it a staple in every apothecary's kit. When you purchased a sack of pepper, you weren't just buying a seasoning. You were purchasing prestige, health, and pleasure, all condensed into a tiny, wrinkled sphere. This immense demand back in Rome is what fueled your entire enterprise, turning a risky voyage into a necessary gamble, all for the sake of the one spice no Roman of taste could possibly live without. While pepper was the reliable backbone of your trade, the truly legendary profits, the fortunes that built palaces and funded legions, were made from the exotic rarities that only the most daring and well-connected importers could reliably procure. Moving beyond the pepper groves of India meant entering a far more treacherous and specialized realm of the spice trade, where each commodity came with its own unique set of geographical puzzles, cultural hurdles, and logistical nightmares. Consider the case of cinnamon, a spice that seemed to embody the very essence of mystery and danger for the Roman world. Your suppliers in Musaris would whisper of its origins in a distant, fabled land the Greeks called Taprobane and we know as Sri Lanka, but the journey to acquire it was shrouded in deliberately crafted legend. Arab traders, the middlemen who controlled this lucrative flow of cinnamon bark, would spin fantastical tales to justify its astronomical price and protect their sources. They claimed it was gathered from the nests of enormous, terrifying birds called cynomologus, who built their homes high on sheer cliffs from the very sticks of cinnamon. To collect it, traders would allegedly leave massive chunks of ox meat at the base of the cliffs for the birds to carry up to their nests. The weight of the meat would cause the nests to collapse, sending the precious cinnamon crashing down to be gathered. This outlandish story wasn't just entertainment. It was a brilliant piece of mercantile disinformation designed to discourage Romans from ever attempting to find the source themselves. The reality was both more mundane and far more complex. True cinnamon, or Cinnamomum verum, did indeed come from the inner bark of small trees grown in Sri Lanka. Its procurement required negotiating with local Sinhalese kings who fiercely guarded their monopoly, dealing with a new set of cultural protocols, and then arranging for the fragile, quill-like bark to be carefully transported back to the Indian coast without losing its delicate, sweet aroma. The markups were staggering, making it worth every lie and logistical headache. Then there was ginger, the fiery rhizome known as zingiber to the Romans. Its procurement pulled your trade network even further east, toward the enigmatic lands of China and Southeast Asia. Unlike pepper spikes or cinnamon bark, ginger presented a unique and frustrating challenge. It was a living root. This meant it was prone to rot, to mold, and to simply dying and becoming worthless if not transported with incredible speed and care. Acquiring it often meant dealing with a different chain of intermediaries, including Chinese traders who had brought it overland to Indian ports. The quality was everything. You had to learn to distinguish between young, juicy, green ginger, which was almost impossible to transport, and the older, dried roots that had been preserved in sugar or honey, or simply sun-dried to a hard, fibrous state that could survive the long voyage. Each form had a different value and a different buyer in Rome. The dried form was prized by physicians for its supposed warming properties and by apothecaries for compounding medicines, while the wealthy would pay a fortune for any preserved ginger that retained a semblance of its fresh, pungent kick to be used in lavish culinary experiments. Managing the spoilage of this living cargo was a constant, high-stakes gamble that could wipe out your investment weeks into the return journey. But perhaps no spice combined exquisite value, mythical origin, and heart-stopping risk quite like saffron. For a Roman spice importer, the most renowned saffron in the world didn't come from the distant east, but from much closer to home, the coastal hills of Cilicia, in what is now Turkey, and particularly from the Greek island of Rhodes. This changed the entire dynamic of the venture. You weren't dealing with distant, foreign kings, but with fellow subjects of the Roman Empire, which in some ways made the competition even more cutthroat and the politics more delicate. The value of saffron was almost incomprehensible. It was quite literally worth more than its weight in gold. This was because of an agonizingly labor-intensive harvesting process. Each vivid crimson stigma had to be painstakingly plucked by hand from the center of a specific type of crocus flower. It takes over 70,000 flowers, each touched by human hands, to produce just a single pound of saffron threads. The fields would bloom for only a few weeks each autumn, and the harvest was a round-the-clock frenzy involving entire communities. Your challenge was not navigating the open ocean, but navigating a different kind of peril, the volatile local politics of production. To secure a supply, you had to arrive weeks in advance of the harvest and negotiate directly with powerful local landowners or cooperative guilds. You were competing against every other wealthy importer from Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, all vying for a limited, perishable product. The negotiation was a tense waiting game, with prices fluctuating daily based on rumors of the coming yield, the weather, and the number of rivals in town. And then there was the ever-present threat of fraud. Because the payoff was so immense, adulteration was rampant. Unscrupulous sellers would mix the precious threads with safflower petals, turmeric-dyed silk fibers, or even moisten the batch to add weight. Your merchant had to have an impeccable eye, testing the aroma, the color, and the texture to ensure he was purchasing pure saffron, not an expensive bundle of clever fakes. A successful deal for saffron required less a navigator and more a diplomat, a financial analyst, and a master of quality control, all rolled into one. Securing even a small chest of these crimson threads was a triumph that could single-handedly elevate your status from a successful merchant to a legend of the trade. A seasoned spice importer quickly learned a fundamental truth of ancient commerce. No ship returned from the east with only pepper in its hold. The same winds that carried you to the Malabar coast also blew upon the sails of traders dealing in a commodity even more legendary and delicate than any spice silk. Diversifying your cargo wasn't just a smart business move, it was an absolute necessity for survival. The economics of such a perilous voyage demanded it. Filling every cubic inch of your ship's hold with a mix of high-value goods was the only way to ensure that even if one commodity's price fell in the Roman markets, the overall venture would still turn a profit. This fundamental strategy of diversification gave rise to the complex intercontinental networks we now romantically call the Silk Road. But for you, it was simply the pragmatic reality of doing business at the edge of the world. The logic was powerfully simple. A ship laden solely with pepper was vulnerable to a single point of failure. Imagine the catastrophe if you arrived back in Alexandria after your year-long journey only to discover that a massive, unexpected shipment from a rival had just arrived, temporarily flooding the market and depressing pepper prices by half. Your entire fortune, risked on the high seas, would be wiped out in a single afternoon of bad market news. But if your hold also contained bolts of Chinese silk, a few sacks of fragrant cloves from even further east, some precious pearls, and perhaps a cask of the coveted blue dye known as indigo, you had options. You could choose to sell the pepper slowly, waiting for the market to rebound, while liquidating the silk immediately to recoup your initial investment and pay your crew. This multi-product portfolio was your financial shock absorber, protecting you from the wild unpredictability of ancient luxury markets. This mercantile strategy is what physically wove together the separate threads of the spice routes, the incense trails, and the silk roads into a single, unimaginably vast web of commerce. A Roman importer in Musaris wasn't just talking to pepper farmers. He was sharing a coffee with a Sogdian trader from Samarkand who had brought down bundles of silk from the caravan cities of Central Asia. That Sogdian trader, in turn, had acquired his silk from a Uyghur merchant who had bought it from a Chinese official at the distant frontier gate of Dunhuang. Your silver denarii, minted with the face of the emperor, might end up funding a Buddhist monastery in Kashmir or a warlord's army in Bactria. You were no longer just a participant in the Indian Ocean spice trade. You were a node in a global network that moved luxury, information, and culture between the Han Empire of China and the Roman Empire of the Mediterranean, with 100 kingdoms and cultures in between. Your decisions in an Indian port could ripple across continents. The practicalities of acquiring silk required a completely different set of skills and contacts. While pepper was bought in vast, open markets, silk was often traded in more discreet private settings. The finest silk came from the land of the seers, the Silk People, a name the Romans used for the Chinese. But it was exceptionally rare for a Roman to ever meet a Chinese trader face to face. The transfer of this incredible fabric was handled through long chains of intermediaries. You would acquire it from a Kushan or Parthian merchant in an Indian port, who had himself bought it from a Sogdian caravaneer at a market in Bactria, who had purchased it from a trader at the Taklamakan desert's edge. Each hand it passed through added its own markup, making Chinese silk astronomically expensive by the time it reached you. You learned to judge its quality not just by its dazzling sheen, which could be imitated with inferior wild silks, but by its weight, its weave, and the consistency of its vibrant dyes, often made from rare insects or minerals. A single bolt of the finest purple-dyed Chinese silk could be sold in Rome for a sum that would purchase a sprawling rural estate. Beyond silk, your discerning eye sought out other luxury goods to fill the remaining space in your hold. Ivory from East African ports was always in high demand among Roman sculptors and furniture makers. The great tusks had to be carefully packed to prevent them from cracking during the voyage. Exotic hardwoods like ebony and teak were prized for making lavish, citrus-scented dining tables for the elite. You might acquire intricate lacquerware from Southeast Asia, or dazzling gemstones like diamonds from the Golconda mines or sapphires from Ceylon. Perhaps most intriguing were the live animals, parrots with vibrant plumage, peacocks whose feathers were a status symbol, or even the occasional cheetah or tiger destined for the games in the Colosseum. Each of these items catered to a different segment of the voracious Roman luxury market, and each came with its own set of handling challenges, negotiation tactics, and potential for massive profit. Ultimately, this diversification did more than just protect your financial investment. It fundamentally transformed your role. You ceased to be a simple spice merchant and became something far greater, a cultural conduit and an international financier. You were no longer just importing goods. You were importing ideas, aesthetics, and technologies. A new musical instrument from India might find its way into a Roman orchestra. A story from a Persian myth, heard over a shared meal in a caravanserai, might inspire a Roman poet. The very concept of Buddhism began to trickle west through these channels. Your journey became about more than personal wealth. It was about weaving the fabric of the ancient world itself, connecting disparate civilizations through the shared, universal language of luxury and desire. Your ship's hold carried not just cargo, but the very threads of history. Successfully returning to Roman waters with your priceless cargo was a moment of pure triumph, but that triumph was instantly tempered by the cold, bureaucratic reality of the empire's financial machinery. The sight of the Italian coastline didn't signal the end of your challenges. It marked the beginning of a final, intricate dance with a different kind of predator, the Roman tax collector. Before a single spice could be sold, before your investors could be paid, and before you could finally count your profit, you had to navigate one of the most complex and notoriously corrupt customs systems the ancient world had ever devised. Your first and most significant financial blow was the portoria, an import duty that was anything but simple. This wasn't a flat fee, it was an ad valorem tax, meaning it was calculated as a percentage of your cargo's total declared value. The standard rate for goods entering from the eastern provinces was a staggering 25%. 1/4 of everything you brought back belonged to the state before you even began. But the calculation was where the real danger lay. You had to stand before the portator, the customs official, and declare the nature and value of every single item in your hold. Under declare the value to save on the tax, and you risked a fine that could be many times the original duty owed, not to mention the potential confiscation of your entire shipment. Over-declare it, either out of an abundance of caution or a lack of understanding of the current market prices in Rome, and you were essentially throwing your own money away, paying a tax on value that didn't exist. This system created a fertile ground for exploitation. The portator held immense discretionary power. He could challenge your valuation, demand to inspect random sacks, a process that could damage delicate goods like saffron, or simply delay your paperwork for days or weeks while your perishable cargo sat on the dock. This power imbalance was the heart of the negotiation. A savvy importer knew that his most valuable asset at this stage wasn't his silver, but his information. You arrived having already sent word ahead to your agents in Ostia or Puteoli to get a precise read on the going rates for pepper, cinnamon, and silk. You walked into that customs house armed with data, ready to politely but firmly justify your declared values with references to recent sales and market trends. Your goal was to present yourself as a knowledgeable professional, not a naive target to be squeezed. For the vast majority of importers, however, data alone was not enough to ensure a smooth passage. This was where the deeply ingrained culture of bribery, or sportula, became an unofficial but essential cost of doing business. You were expected to offer a gift to facilitate the process. This wasn't a crude handful of coins slipped into a palm. It was a nuanced ritual. The gift had to be valuable enough to be persuasive: a fine bolt of silk, a small but exquisite ivory carving, or a pouch of the highest quality peppercorns, but not so extravagant as to be seen as an admission of guilt or an attempt to declare a fraudulent value. The timing and presentation were everything. It was often handled by a trusted freedman or a specialized middleman, a delator who had existing relationships with the customs officials and knew the going rate for a favorable appraisal. Paying this bribe was seen not as corruption, but as a pragmatic investment in efficiency. It guaranteed your valuation was accepted without further tedious inspection, your paperwork was processed immediately, and your ship was cleared to unload before your goods could spoil or be pilfered. In the high-stakes world of the spice trade, a predictable bribe was always cheaper than an unpredictable delay. Beyond the central portoria, a labyrinth of other fees and officials lay in wait, each with a hand outstretched. The vigiles, the port's firewatch and security force, required a donation to ensure they patrolled extra diligently near your valuable warehouse. The mensors, the official measurers and weighers, needed an incentive to be careful and accurate with their scales rather than accidentally spilling your precious saffron during the assessment. Even the clerks who transcribed the official paperwork expected a small gratuity for their swift and error-free work. The most successful importers didn't fight this system. They budgeted for it meticulously before they ever left Rome. They understood that these unofficial costs were simply another line item on their ledger, a necessary tariff for operating within the immense and greedy engine of the Roman state. The true measure of a spice importer's skill wasn't just his courage at sea or his cunning in foreign markets. It was his diplomatic finesse and financial foresight in safely navigating his own country's voracious and complicated welcome home. Your triumph at the customs house was immediately followed by a race against time and the elements. That mountain of spices, which had survived pirates and monsoons, now faced its most insidious enemy, the humid, temperate air of Italy itself. Preventing spoilage wasn't a matter of simple storage. It was a high-stakes science that demanded specialized knowledge and infrastructure. The moment your cargo left the ship, every second counted. You couldn't simply dump sacks of pepper in a damp cellar or leave delicate saffron exposed to the Mediterranean sun. Doing so would see your fortune literally rot away before it could be sold. The successful importer had to become a master of preservation, controlling airflow, moisture, and temperature with techniques that were remarkably sophisticated for the ancient world. Your first line of defense was the warehouse itself, the harem. This was not a simple shed or a dark basement. A proper spice harem was a marvel of Roman engineering, specifically designed to combat the two great enemies of dried goods, dampness and pests. The most critical feature was its elevation. These warehouses were built with raised floors, suspended on short pillars or pilings with gaps between the floorboards. This created a constant flow of air beneath the entire storage area, a passive ventilation system that wicked away ground moisture and prevented the musty damp that could ruin an entire shipment of cinnamon bark in a matter of weeks. The walls were constructed of thick, fired brick or stone, which acted as a natural insulator, keeping the interior cool and buffered against the temperature swings of the Italian summer. Small, strategically placed windows high on the walls allowed for a controlled cross breeze without letting in direct sunlight or rain. Inside this carefully controlled environment, the spices themselves required individualized attention. Pepper, your workhorse commodity, was relatively hardy but needed to be kept perfectly dry. It was stored in massive, double-layered dolia huge ceramic jars, sealed with wax or clay, or in sturdy linen sacks that were themselves kept on elevated wooden pallets, never touching the floor. Ginger, which could still harbor hidden moisture, was often kept in smaller, ventilated crates filled with dry sand or rice husks, which acted as desiccants, passively drawing out any residual humidity that might lead to mold. But the real crown jewels, the saffron and the highest grade cinnamon, demanded royal treatment. These were stored in smaller, airtight containers made of glass, polished bronze, or lead-lined wooden boxes. The goal was to create a hermetic seal, locking in the volatile aromatic oils that defined their immense value, and locking out any ambient moisture or odors that could contaminate their delicate fragrance. The human element was just as crucial as the architectural one. You employed a specialized warehouse manager, the horarius, whose entire expertise was the maintenance of this delicate ecosystem. His job was a constant cycle of inspection and maintenance. He would make daily rounds, sniffing the air for the first telltale scent of mildew, running his hands through sacks of pepper to feel for any alarming warmth or clumping that signaled the beginning of fermentation. He was responsible for the legion of clay pots filled with quicklime or salt that were strategically placed around the warehouse to absorb excess moisture from the air. He also managed the most potent weapon in the arsenal, smoke. Certain spices, particularly peppercorns, could be gently fumigated with the smoke from specific aromatic woods like cedar or sandalwood. This wasn't just a preservative measure. It was also a way to add a subtle, desirable flavor note, and most importantly, to deter the endless armies of weevils, moths, and rodents that saw your fortune as their personal banquet. The horarius was the unsung guardian of your wealth, a man whose keen senses and constant vigilance stood between you and catastrophic loss, ensuring that when the time was right to sell, your spices would be as pristine and potent as the day you acquired them. Determining the final price of your spices in Rome was a complex calculation, a delicate dance between recouping immense costs and capitalizing on almost mythical demand. You weren't just slapping a random number on a sack of pepper. You were engaging in a form of high-stakes economic psychology, setting a value that reflected the peril of the journey, the exclusivity of the product, and the seemingly bottomless vanity of the Roman elite. The first and most concrete number you had to cover was your base cost, a figure that was staggering before you even factored in a single sestertius of profit. This started with the original purchase price paid to the Tamil or Arabian merchant in Musaris, a sum already inflated by their own expertise and the knowledge of your desperation to fill your hole. Then you layered on the entire cost of the voyage itself the construction or leasing of the ship, the wages and provisions for your crew of 50 or more for over a year, the fees for your armed guards, the bribes to officials, and the interest on any loans you had taken out from investors to fund the venture. This alone could represent a sum large enough to feed a small city for a decade. Only after this mountain of expenses was accounted for could you even begin to think about your own reward. The markup from source to consumer was so astronomical it defies modern comprehension. That single pound of black pepper you bought for 1 denarius on the Malabar coast could effortlessly sell for 80 denarii in the markets of Rome. Ginger or cinnamon could see its value increase by a factor of 100 or more. For the ultra-rare commodities like first-quality Cilician saffron, the multiplier could reach an almost mythical 10%. This wasn't mere profit, it was alchemy. These multipliers were necessary, not just greedy, because of the immense overhead and the ever-present risk of total loss. You weren't pricing based on the cost of the good itself. You were pricing based on the cost of the story behind it, the story of a year-long odyssey across treacherous seas, a story of battles with pirates and negotiations with foreign kings, a story that very nearly ended at the bottom of the ocean. That story was what the Roman consumer was truly buying, and its value was incalculable. Arriving back in Italy, your first and most critical decision was whether to sell your entire cargo in one lump sum to a powerful wholesale distributor, a negotiator, or to hold it and sell it off slowly yourself. Selling wholesale was the faster, safer option. A major distributor would pay you a huge amount of cash upfront, immediately making your venture profitable and allowing you to pay your crew and investors. The trade-off was that you received only a fraction of the final retail price. This distributor assumed all the risk of storage, spoilage, and market fluctuations, and he would reap the lion's share of the eventual profit. For many importers, especially after a particularly harrowing journey, the security of a guaranteed, immediate payoff was too tempting to refuse. The true legends of the spice trade, however, were the ones who played the long game. They owned their own warehouses and had the capital to wait. They would release their spices onto the market slowly, carefully controlling the supply to keep prices high. They understood the rhythms of Roman luxury. They knew to hold back their best cinnamon until just before the Saturnalia festival, when every wealthy patrician was desperate to impress his guests with the most exotic foods and wines. They would create artificial scarcity, letting it be known that a certain shipment of particularly fine Malabathrin was the last of its kind, driving a bidding war among rival senators' wives. This required not just wealth, but a deep understanding of social currents and a network of informants in the homes of the powerful to gauge demand. The profit margins from this direct retail approach could be double or triple what the wholesaler offered, turning a successful voyage into a generational fortune. Ultimately, the final price tag was a mirror held up to the Roman soul. A wealthy Roman didn't purchase a handful of peppercorns to make his food taste better. He purchased it to broadcast his place in the world. Using a rare, expensive spice was a silent, aromatic declaration of one's sophistication, one's wealth, and one's connection to the far-flung power of the empire itself. The price was therefore almost elastic. For the right customer, the one determined to outdo his rivals at a banquet, there was effectively no upper limit. As a spice importer, your genius lay in understanding this psychology perfectly. You weren't just selling an agricultural product. You were selling status, identity, and a tangible piece of the impossible. The sheer weight of the silver and gold required to buy what you offered was not a barrier to sale. It was the entire point of the purchase. Yet surviving the natural and bureaucratic perils was only half the battle, for the most dangerous threats often wore a human face and a friendly smile. The world of the spice importer was a brutally competitive arena where fortunes were won not just through courage and skill, but also through cunning, deception, and ruthless betrayal. Your rival wasn't just another merchant. He was a predator who would stop at nothing to learn your routes, sabotage your shipments, and steal your hard-won suppliers, viewing your downfall as the direct path to his own enrichment. This was a high-stakes game where the rules were unwritten and the penalties were financial ruin or worse. Industrial espionage was the most common and insidious weapon in this silent war. Rival importers would employ networks of informants, often bribing members of your own crew or the dockworkers who loaded your ship. A disgruntled sailor, promised a heavier purse of silver by a competitor, might reveal your intended sailing date or the specific port in India you were targeting. This information was pure gold. A rival could then dispatch his own ship early to intercept your suppliers, buying up the entire season's harvest of high-quality pepper before you even arrived, leaving you with inferior goods or forcing you to pay a catastrophic premium. Others might target your logistics, learning the location of your hidden warehouses and arranging for a mysterious, accidental fire or a conveniently timed break in that would destroy your inventory just before the high-demand holiday season. In a world without patents or copyrights, your trade secrets, your navigational charts, your lists of reliable foreign contacts, your formulas for preserving ginger were your most vulnerable assets, constantly under threat from prying eyes and well-paid traders. The sabotage could escalate from information theft to direct and physical interference. There were dark whispers in the taverns of Ostia of ships whose hull planking had been secretly weakened with strategically placed auger holes, designed to give way under the stress of the open ocean, sending a competitor and his cargo to a watery grave with no evidence left behind. More common was the tampering with supplies. A rival agent might sneak aboard and contaminate a ship's freshwater barrels with salt water or spoil its stores of hardtack, ensuring the crew would be weakened by thirst and disease long before they reached their destination. This kind of treachery was almost impossible to prove and even harder to guard against, creating a pervasive atmosphere of paranoia where you trusted no one outside your most inner circle. In this cutthroat environment, survival depended on forging alliances far more powerful than any single ship. The smartest importers understood that their most valuable asset wasn't in their hold, but in the political connections they cultivated back in Rome. Securing a powerful patron, a senator, a wealthy equestrian, or even a member of the imperial family, was your ultimate shield and sword. This patronage system, known as clientela, was the bedrock of Roman society, and in the spice trade, it was your lifeline. A powerful patron provided the immense capital needed to finance a fleet, not just a single ship. More importantly, he offered political and legal protection. If a rival tried to have you falsely accused of tax evasion or sued for a fabricated debt, your patron's influence could make the accusation disappear. His name alone could intimidate customs officials into processing your paperwork fairly and discourage lesser rivals from attempting any schemes against you. In return, you, as the client, offered your patron something he desperately craved: a reliable, massive, and discreet source of wealth. The profits from your voyages filled his coffers, allowing him to fund his political campaigns, throw the most lavish games, and build monumental villas, all while maintaining a public facade of traditional wealth from land ownership. This relationship created a powerful feedback loop. Your success fueled his political power, and his growing influence in turn cleared more obstacles from your path, granting you access to better permits, privileged market information, and even favorable legislation. The most successful spice importers became fabulously wealthy, but they were never truly independent. They were the economic engines for the most powerful men in Rome, their fortunes forever intertwined with the volatile world of politics. To operate at the highest level was to accept that your business was always, inevitably, a political business. Yet even with a powerful senatorial patron, the absolute pinnacle of political connection, the ultimate key to untouchable success, lay in securing the favor of a single household, the largest and most demanding consumer of spices in the entire Roman world, the imperial family itself. To become a supplier to the Palatine was to enter a different realm of commerce altogether, one where profit was secondary to prestige, and where a single misstep could have consequences far more severe than mere bankruptcy. The emperor's court was a vortex of consumption, a place where spices were used not by the ounce, but by the cartload, for everything from perfuming the halls during a reception to seasoning the vast quantities of food prepared for the Praetorian Guard. Supplying this endless demand was the most lucrative and most dangerous contract an importer could ever secure. The path to this privileged position was never through open bidding or public markets. It was a labyrinth of courtiers, freedmen, and personal tastes. Your initial point of contact was rarely the emperor himself, but rather the vast bureaucracy of the imperial household, managed by the praefectus Annani, the prefect in charge of the city's supply, or more likely, the emperor's chief chamberlain, a powerful freedman who controlled access to the royal palate. These men were the true gatekeepers. Their influence was immense, but they were also notoriously venal. Winning their support required a combination of flawless product and extravagant gifts, a chest of the rarest silphium, a promise of a percentage of the profits, or the guarantee of first refusal on any exotic new spice you might discover on your travels. You weren't just selling goods, you were buying a powerful advocate within the innermost circle of power. Once you secured a trial shipment, the scrutiny was unlike anything you faced in the public market. Imperial food tasters, the prigostators, would sample your pepper not just for poison, but for potency, aroma, and consistency. Physicians from the emperor's personal staff would inspect your ginger and saffron, judging their medicinal quality against exacting standards set by court doctors like Galen. Your cinnamon would be compared to samples from the imperial reserves, which might have been aging for decades. Failure to meet these standards meant immediate and permanent exclusion. But success meant your spices were served at the emperor's table, a silent, aromatic endorsement that instantly made your brand the most sought after in Rome. Senators and wealthy equestrians would pay a massive premium for goods known to be fit for an emperor, allowing you to command prices others could only dream of. This relationship, however, was a double-edged sword. The emperor's favor was as fickle as the Mediterranean winds. A new chamberlain could take power and cancel your contract in favor of his own man. The emperor's personal tastes might suddenly change, perhaps on the advice of a new philosopher or physician who decried foreign spices as corrupting. A rival importer with better political connections or a larger bribe could suddenly supplant you. And worst of all, should the emperor fall to assassination or coup, his suppliers were often targets for the new regime, their wealth confiscated under charges of corruption, or simply because the new emperor wanted to install his own favorites. Your entire business became inextricably linked to the stability of the throne, making the volatile world of Roman politics your direct concern. The same connection that made you could break you in an instant. Yet for those who navigated these treacherous waters successfully, the rewards were immortality. Your name would be recorded in the imperial ledgers. You gained the right to stamp your amphorae with seals indicating imperial approval, a marketing tool so powerful it guaranteed instant sales. You might be granted special privileges, like preferential treatment at the customs house or tax exemptions on your shipping, further crushing your competitors. The profits from a single multi-year contract could be so vast they allowed you to retire and enter the equestrian order, transforming your family from merchants into respected members of the landed aristocracy. Ultimately, supplying the palace was the final, definitive step in the spice importer's journey. It was the moment you ceased to be merely wealthy and became, instead, a permanent part of the machinery of empire, your fortune and your legacy forever woven into the very fabric of Roman power and luxury. The success of your entire venture, the difference between a legendary return and a bankrupting failure, all came down to your mastery of a single, invisible force, the rhythm of the wind. Forget maps or stars for a moment. The true calendar of the spice trade was written in the sky, in the predictable yet terrifyingly powerful cycle of the monsoon seasons. Understanding this cycle wasn't just a navigational skill. It was the very heart of your strategic planning. A mistake in timing wasn't a simple delay. It was a catastrophe that could erase an entire year's work and leave your ship rotting in a foreign port while your creditors in Rome demanded answers you couldn't give. The entire system revolved around two opposing winds, each governing a specific leg of the journey with an iron fist. For your outward voyage from the Red Sea to India, your lifeline was the perilous wind, the southwestern monsoon. This wasn't a gentle breeze. It was a mighty, relentless river of air that flowed from the ocean onto the Indian subcontinent. A skilled navigator would wait for this wind to reach its peak strength in the early summer, around the month the Romans called Iunius. Catching it perfectly meant your heavily laden ship could be carried directly across the open ocean to the Malabar coast in a breathtaking 40 days or less, a journey that would have taken months of cautious coastal hopping. This wind was your engine, your fuel, and your greatest ally, but it was a fickle friend. Arrive at the Egyptian port of Berenice too early, and you would be stuck waiting for weeks, watching your carefully calculated schedule dissolve as your provisions dwindled and your crew grew restless. Arrive too late, and you risked catching the tail end of the monsoon, which could mean being caught in a storm of unimaginable fury or worse, finding yourself becalmed in the middle of the Indian Ocean with no wind to fill your sails and no hope of moving forward. Your window for the return journey was governed by the northeastern monsoon, which began its flow in the opposite direction around the month of November. This wind was your ticket home, pushing you back from India toward the Arabian Peninsula and the safety of Roman-controlled ports. This created an incredibly tight, non-negotiable schedule. You had to complete all your trading, haggling, and loading in India within a matter of a few short months. Every day you spent negotiating over the price of ginger or waiting for a final shipment of cinnamon was a day stolen from your return window. If you missed the shift in the wind, you were faced with an impossible choice. You could attempt a desperate and almost certainly suicidal journey against the monsoon, a feat no Roman merchant ship was capable of. Or you could accept your fate and settle in for a long, expensive, and dangerous wait. Stranded for a year in a place like Musaris, you were no longer a triumphant merchant. You were a vulnerable foreigner with a rapidly depreciating asset. Your silver was slowly drained to pay for food and lodgings for your entire crew for 12 months. Your ship, hauled onto the beach to protect it from the harsh weather, required constant, costly maintenance to prevent worms from devouring the hull. The local merchants, knowing your desperate situation, would offer you pennies on the denarius for your remaining trade goods, aware that you needed liquid capital to survive the wait. Meanwhile, back in Rome, your investors would assume the worst, that you had been lost at sea. Your family might even hold a funeral in your absence. Your carefully built reputation would evaporate. When you finally did return a full year later, you wouldn't be greeted as a hero, but as a ghost who had to explain a mountain of new debt and a cargo that was now a season out of date. The monsoon was the unchallenged master of your fate, and your entire profession was an act of profound faith in your ability to read its moods and bow to its schedule without a moment's hesitation. The vessel that carried your dreams and your fortune across the known world was a masterpiece of Roman naval engineering, a far cry from the fragile rafts or simple sailing boats one might imagine. At the heart of this maritime empire was the corbetta, the workhorse of the long-distance spice trade. This was not a warship built for speed and ramming. It was a majestic, bloated giant of the sea, a floating warehouse designed for a single purpose: capacity. Picture a hull so broad and deep it could swallow over 300 tons of cargo, enough pepper to season every meal in Rome for a month. Its most distinctive feature was the immense, fully sheeted mainsail, a vast expanse of woven linen that could catch the faintest whisper of a breeze, propelling your precious goods forward even when the winds were lazy and uncooperative. But the true genius of the corbetta lay in its secondary Artemis sail, rigged on a forward-sloping mast over the bow. This smaller sail acted as a stabilizer and a rudder, giving the captain unprecedented control over his unwieldy vessel, allowing him to tack against the wind in a way that would have been impossible for simpler ships. This innovation meant you weren't entirely at the mercy of the prevailing winds. You had a fighting chance to maneuver out of danger or toward a more favorable current. This technological marvel was born from centuries of accumulated Mediterranean shipbuilding knowledge, but it was constantly being refined by the brutal demands of the Indian Ocean run. The hulls of these ocean-going behemoths were built shell first, with planks of high-quality Aleppo pine or Lebanese cedar edge, joined with incredibly precise mortise and tenon joints, creating a strong, flexible skeleton that could flex and groan with the waves without splintering apart. The seams were then caulked with pitch and driven oakum, making the vessel as watertight as humanly possible. But the most critical adaptation for the spice trade was the strengthening of the hull against the specific terror of the monsoon season. Shipwrights added extra internal bracing and reinforced the keel to withstand the incredible pounding of the open ocean waves, knowing that a single journey across the Indian Ocean would subject the ship to stresses a lifetime of Mediterranean coastal trading would never impose. Your ship was, in every sense, a purpose-built machine, its every curve and joint a calculated response to the unimaginable value and immense peril of the cargo it was designed to carry. Guiding this floating fortress required more than just courage. It demanded a profound understanding of the heavens themselves. In an age before magnetic compasses or GPS, your navigator was a master of celestial mechanics, a man who literally used the universe as his chart. His primary tool was the stellarium, a simple but effective device for measuring the angle of stars above the horizon. By tracking the consistent path of the North Star, Polaris, in the northern sky, he could maintain a reliable sense of latitude, ensuring you were on the correct north-south axis for your journey. But the real art came in navigating the open ocean stretches, particularly the daring direct crossing of the Indian Ocean. For this, he relied on the sun, using its predictable arc and the length of the day to gauge his position. He carried detailed periploi, sailing manuals that didn't just list ports, but contained crucial intelligence on currents, seasonal winds, the depth of coastal waters, and even the color and smell of the sea near certain landmarks. During the day, the natural world provided a constant stream of navigational clues that the trained eye could read like a book. The sight of certain seabirds, like gannets or terns, could indicate the proximity of land long before it was visible from the deck. The color of the water changed from the deep indigo of the open ocean to the greener hues of shallower coastal shelves. Skilled navigators could even taste the sea, detecting the silt from a distant river delta carried on the currents. At night, the entire cosmos became his map. He knew the patterns of the constellations not as myths, but as directional markers and seasonal guides. The rising of the constellation Orion in a certain part of the sky signaled the approach of the sailing season, while the position of the Great Bear, Ursa Major, helped him maintain his course. This was not a science of precision instruments, but a deeply intuitive art form based on relentless observation and a vast, orally transmitted library of knowledge. The safety of your ship, your crew, and your empire-shaking fortune rested entirely on this one man's ability to decipher the silent language of the stars and the sea. Yet even after navigating treacherous seas and surviving brutal negotiations, the Roman spice importer faced a final, insidious threat that could unravel everything from the comfort of his own warehouse, the cunning art of fraud. The astronomical value of spices created an irresistible incentive for deception at every level of the trade, turning every transaction into a test of your expertise and every delivery into a potential minefield of hidden fakery. For an importer, your reputation was your most valuable asset, a fragile thing built on years of reliable quality. A single shipment of adulterated goods, whether you were the victim or the perpetrator, could destroy that reputation in an instant, branding you as either a fool who could be cheated or a knave who could not be trusted. The methods of deception were as varied as they were ingenious, forcing you to become a master of forensic quality control. The most common trick was simple dilution. A sack of premium black peppercorns might be filled out with cheaper, look-alike berries from the Skinnis Mall tree, known as pink peppercorns, or even with dried, worthless juniper berries that added weight but no flavor. More sophisticated fraudsters would coat inferior or old peppercorns in a thin layer of olive oil or lead acetate to give them a deceptively shiny, high-quality appearance. For precious saffron, the most expensive substance by weight in the ancient world, the schemes were even more elaborate. Unscrupulous sellers would painstakingly mix in safflower petals, marigold stamens, or even shreds of dyed beef or silk fibers that mimicked the delicate crimson threads. Sometimes they would load the saffron by moistening it with honey or sugar water, adding significant weight to the bundle and dramatically reducing its potency. Your trained eye had to catch the difference in texture, the slight stickiness to the touch, or the unnatural uniformity of the color that betrayed the fake. Detecting these forgeries required a ritual of inspection that was both theatrical and deadly serious. You never, ever trusted a sample from the top of a sack. Instead, you would demand the right to plunge your arm deep into the container, pulling a handful from the very bottom to check for hidden ballast like sand, lead shot, or stones that added dead weight. You would crush peppercorns between your fingers, not just to test for dryness and avoid mold, but to release their aroma fresh, potent pepper had a sharp, clean scent, while old or adulterated stock often smelled musty or flat. For cinnamon, you learned to snap a stick to hear the sound it made. True cinnamon had a distinct, brittle crack, while cheaper cassia bark was tougher and more fibrous. The most trusted importers were known to taste tiny pinches of ginger or saffron right there on the dock, their educated palates able to discern the authentic, fiery kick of real zingiber from the dull, woody taste of a substitute. This performance was crucial. It sent a clear message to the merchant you were dealing with. I am not a novice to be swindled. My standards are uncompromising, and my expertise is real. The consequences of failure in this arena were severe and twofold. If you were caught knowingly selling adulterated goods in Rome, the legal and social penalties could be ruinous. While we have no specific laws detailing punishment for spice fraud, Roman legal precedent from the Lex Matilia on fuller's fraud suggests that public shaming and financial restitution were likely outcomes. Your name would be dragged through the mud, your clients would abandon you, and you could face exile from the professional guilds that facilitated trade. However, the greater danger was being on the receiving end of the fraud. If you unknowingly purchased and then resold a large quantity of fake spices, the financial loss was total. You had paid a fortune for worthless filler, and when your elite clients in Rome discovered the deception, your reputation for quality evaporated forever. In a business built on trust and exclusivity, being known as the man who sold painted silk threads as saffron was a death sentence. Therefore, developing a ruthless eye for authenticity wasn't just a business skill. It was your primary shield, the final, critical defense that protected your fortune, your good name, and your very standing in the high-stakes world of ancient Roman luxury. Months could stretch interminably in a foreign port like Musaris, a forced pause in your grand ambition where you traded the familiar perils of the sea for the slow, grinding challenges of being a permanent stranger. The rhythm of your life shifted from the urgent demands of navigation to the patient art of waiting, a test of character that many a seasoned sailor found harder to bear than any storm. Your ship, hauled onto the beach to protect its hull from the destructive teredo worm, became a silent, grounded monument to your stalled fortune, requiring a constant guard against rot and a daily inspection that felt more like a ritual of hope than practical maintenance. Your crew, once a disciplined unit, now dispersed in the teeming port, some finding work on the docks to earn their keep, others succumbing to the temptations of the local palm wine, their morale and your authority slowly eroding with each passing week. You were no longer a daring captain. You were a manager of boredom and anxiety, constantly calculating the drain on your finances as your carefully hoarded silver was paid out for food, lodging, and the endless, petty bribes required to secure a decent warehouse space for what remained of your trade goods. This extended exile forced a depth of cultural adaptation that the brief stopover of a successful trading season never demanded. You had to learn not just a few phrases of Tamil for bartering, but the intricate social codes that governed daily life. The simple act of sharing a meal became a diplomatic exercise. You learned to eat with your right hand only, to accept cups of spiced tea without immediately asking for the price of the spices within it, and to understand that a direct Roman-style yes or no in business could be seen as shockingly rude compared to the more nuanced, circuitous negotiations that local merchants preferred. You might be invited to a local wedding or a temple festival, spectacles of vibrant color and deafening music that were utterly alien to the marble forums of Rome. These experiences were fascinating, yet they constantly underscored your otherness. You were a guest, an observer, never truly part of the community, a feeling that became increasingly isolating as the seasons turned. Within this strange new reality, temporary relationships became your emotional and practical lifeline. The most crucial was often with a local agent or an influential merchant's family who took you under their wing. This wasn't pure charity. Your presence represented a long-term business opportunity for them as well. They might offer you a room in their compound, a gesture that provided immense security and a taste of family life far from home. In return, you shared stories of Rome, offered gifts of Italian wine or glassware, and provided a vital link to the vast economic engine of the West. These bonds, built on mutual necessity and genuine, if limited, affection, could become the foundation of your future trading success. Other relationships were more fleeting but no less critical. A romance with a local woman offered comfort and a much-needed respite from loneliness, though both parties understood its inevitable expiration date the moment the wind shifted. These connections were bittersweet, intense precisely because they existed outside the normal rules and constraints of your life, destined to be memories you carried home rather than a future you could build. And beneath it all, beneath the novelty and the strategic networking, lay a profound and constant undercurrent of homesickness. It was a physical ache triggered by the smallest things, the smell of bread baking in a way that was almost, but not quite, like Roman bread, the sight of a constellation in the night sky that reminded you of the view from your own villa, or a snippet of Latin overheard from another stranded Roman crewman. You worried incessantly about events at home. Was your family well? Had a rival used your extended absence to poach your clients or influence your patron? Was the emperor still stable, or had some new political turmoil erupted that would change the rules of commerce upon your return? You were trapped in a state of suspended animation, your life in Italy moving on without you while you were stuck in a beautiful, bewildering, and increasingly frustrating limbo. The exotic spices that perfumed the air, the very reason for your being there, began to smell less like profit and more like the scent of your own captivity, a constant reminder of the immense distance between you and everything you called home. But the journey home was a trial of a different kind, a slow burning anxiety that gnawed at the soul far more than the sudden terror of a storm. With your hold now packed to the ceiling with the very definition of portable wealth, every creak of the ship's timbers, every unfamiliar sail on the horizon, was a potential portent of disaster. The return voyage was psychologically brutal. Outward bound, you sailed with silver, a heavy but ultimately replaceable commodity. Now you sailed with the physical manifestation of your entire gamble, your year of life, and the fortunes of your investors. A single leak in a precious amphora of saffron could ruin it. A week of becalmed seas could allow dampness to seep into the pepper sacks, starting a hidden mold that would spread like a plague through your entire cargo. The constant, low-grade fear of spoilage was a relentless companion, making you and your warehouse manager obsessive in your daily inspections below deck. This deep-seated dread was perfectly justified, for the sea lanes back to Rome were a well-patrolled hunting ground for the most sophisticated pirates of the ancient world. The Cilician pirates of the Mediterranean were a known threat, but the real danger on the return journey came from the organized fleets of the Red Sea and the coast of Arabia Felix. These were not disorganized bandits. They were maritime corporations of plunder. Their fast, agile dhows, powered by lateen sails and banks of oars, could easily overtake your heavy, lumbering corbetta, wallowing low in the water from its immense weight of spices. They knew the schedules of the merchant fleets, they knew the value of the cargo, and their tactics were ruthlessly efficient. They would rarely engage in a pitched battle. Instead, they would swarm a ship, using grapnels to lock on and board in overwhelming numbers. Your highly paid guards were your best insurance. But if the pirate force was large enough, even the most disciplined mercenaries would eventually be overpowered. The goal was not to kill you, but to capture you and your ship intact. A wealthy Roman importer was far more valuable alive, to be ransomed back to his family, while his cargo was sold on a shadow market that fed the very elites you were racing to supply. The mental toll of this constant vigilance was immense. Sleep became a fragmented luxury, punctuated by the night watch's calls and your own imagination conjuring threats from the sound of the waves. You found yourself staring at the horizon for hours, straining to distinguish between a harmless fishing boat and the sleek profile of a pirate scout. The camaraderie of the outward journey often frayed under this sustained pressure, with crewmen becoming irritable and superstitious, seeing bad omens in the flight of birds or the color of the sunset. The immense value sitting beneath their feet transformed the ship from a shared home into a floating target, and every man knew his survival depended on the vigilance of the others. Then, after what felt like an eternity of tension, the lookout's cry would ring out from the masthead, a thin, smoky line on the horizon that wasn't cloud. As the ship drew closer, that line would resolve into the familiar, welcoming profile of the Italian coastline, the rugged hills of Brundisium or the distant shadow of Vesuvius guarding the approach to Puteoli. The relief that washed over the ship was a physical force, so potent it could bring seasoned sailors to tears. The anxious knots in your stomach, clenched for months, would finally begin to loosen. The shouts of the crew were no longer calls of alarm but cheers of exhausted triumph. The scent in the air changed, carrying the familiar smells of home wood smoke from coastal villas, the damp earth of Italian pine forests, a stark and comforting contrast to the exotic perfumes of the East that had filled your lungs for so long. This was not the end of your journey, not by a long shot, but it was the end of its most perilous chapter. You had successfully stolen a fortune from the edge of the world and brought it home. The sight of that coastline was a silent promise that the gambit had, thus far, paid off, and that the even more complex challenges of profit and politics now awaited you on solid ground. But reaching the harbor at Ostia or Puteoli was only the prelude to the final, most public act of your entire venture, the high-stakes theater of the spice auction. This was not a quiet, private sale. It was a roaring, competitive spectacle where your fortune would be made or broken in front of a jeering, cheering, and utterly merciless crowd. The auction block, or atrium auctionarium, was your stage, and the preco, the fast-talking auctioneer, was your master of ceremonies. His role was far more than just listing prices. He was a showman, a psychologist, and a conductor of greed, whose entire purpose was to whip the assembled buyers into a competitive frenzy, driving the final price of your precious cargo to its absolute zenith. The preparation for this grand event began days before the first bid was ever called. Your spices, carefully preserved in your private warehouse, were meticulously sorted and graded one final time. The pepper was separated into first, second, and third quality batches. The finest cinnamon quills were polished and displayed separately from the more common cassia bark. Saffron was carefully weighed out into small, exquisite glass unguentaria, each one a self-contained display of unimaginable wealth. This grading was a critical strategic move. By creating tiers of quality, you could appeal to a wider range of buyers, from the ultra-wealthy senatorial class who demanded only the best to the well-heeled equites and successful freedmen who sought a slightly more affordable taste of luxury. Presenting a homogeneous, mixed-quality lot was the mark of an amateur. A master importer showcased his cargo like a jeweler displaying his gems, each category priced to maximize its specific market. The auction itself was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to inflame desire and eliminate hesitation. The preco would begin by offering a small, tantalizing sample of the goods to the key buyers, allowing them to feel the dryness of the peppercorns, inhale the intense aroma of the ginger, and marvel at the vivid crimson color of the saffron. He wouldn't just list the product, he would sell the story. He would dramatically recount the perils of your journey, the narrow escape from pirates, the battle with the monsoon winds, the shrewd negotiations with mysterious Eastern kings. He emphasized the rarity, the exclusivity, and the sheer impossibility of acquiring such treasures anywhere else. This narrative transformed your spices from mere commodities into tangible pieces of an epic adventure. And the elite of Rome were more than willing to pay a premium to own a fragment of that legend. Your own strategy as the seller was one of subtle but firm control, often conducted through discreet signals to the auctioneer from the sidelines. You might have a trusted agent planted in the crowd to kick off the bidding with a strong, confident offer, setting a high anchor price that would shape the expectations of all subsequent bidders. If the bidding seemed to be stalling at a price you found unacceptable, you could signal the preco to temporarily halt the auction, creating a moment of tense uncertainty that often prompted a rival bidder to jump in with a higher offer rather than lose the lot entirely. The goal was always to foster competition, to make the buyers in the room compete not just for the product, but for the status of winning. For the wealthy Romans in attendance, outbidding a rival was a public demonstration of their superior financial power and social standing, a victory almost as sweet as the spices themselves. The rhythm of the sale was also a tool for maximizing profit. The auctioneer would often start with the most common goods, like second-quality pepper, to warm up the crowd and get them comfortable with the act of spending. Then he would build momentum, moving through better grades and different spices, each lot fetching a higher price than the last as the competitive spirit took hold. He would save the absolute crown jewels of your cargo, the purest saffron, the rarest malabathron leaves, for the very end, when the crowd was most intoxicated by the atmosphere of acquisitive fever. By that point, the top bidders, having already committed significant sums, were often determined to secure the ultimate prize, leading to breathtaking final bids that could dwarf all the previous sales combined. In the roaring, dust-filled air of the auction house, your year of risk, hardship, and calculation finally found its value, measured out in the shouts of the preco and the nodding assent of Rome's most powerful and hungry consumers. The immense fortune you earned was never meant to remain a number on a ledger or coins in a chest. It was the key that unlocked a far greater prize, a permanent seat at the very heart of Roman society. For the most successful spice importers, the ultimate goal was not just wealth, but the profound and lasting transformation of their family's status, a metamorphosis from wealthy merchant to respected aristocrat. This journey of social climbing, known as dignitas, was a carefully calculated investment strategy far more complex than any spice deal. And it began with the most foundational asset in the Roman world, land. The first and most crucial purchase for any newly wealthy importer was a sprawling agricultural estate, a latifundium in the Italian countryside. This was not a mere vanity project or a country retreat. It was a powerful symbolic and economic statement. In the Roman mind, True, respectable wealth was not earned through commerce, which was often viewed with suspicion, but was generated passively from the land itself. Owning a productive estate with its vineyards, olive groves, and grain fields allowed you to recast your narrative. You were no longer the man who braved pirates for profit. You were a landowner, a paterfamilias overseeing his ancestral fields, a figure of stability and tradition. This land provided a safe, respectable, and permanent income stream that was immune to the wild fluctuations of the spice markets. A bad monsoon season in India might ruin one importer, but your fields in Campania would continue to produce wine and oil, ensuring your family's security for generations. It was the bedrock upon which all future legacy was built. With a solid agricultural foundation established, the next step was the construction of a villa that served as a physical monument to your success. This wasn't just a large house. It was a manifesto in marble and fresco. You would spare no expense, hiring the most sought-after Greek architects and artisans to create a palace that proclaimed your refined taste and worldliness. The design would deliberately incorporate elements from your travels, intricate mosaics depicting scenes from Indian mythology, a private bath complex heated by a hypocaust system inspired by Eastern designs, and colonnaded gardens filled with exotic plants you had brought back yourself. The centerpiece of this villa was always the triclinium, the dining room. Here, you would host lavish banquets for the local elite, serving food seasoned with your own spices on silver platters. Every detail, from the quality of the wines served to the learned conversation you facilitated about foreign lands, was a deliberate performance designed to demonstrate that you were not a crude merchant, but a man of culture, education, and immense means, a worthy peer to the born aristocracy. The final and most audacious investment was in a political career, the ultimate validation of your new status. This required a different kind of currency, patronage and public generosity. You would become a benefactor to your local town, funding the construction of a new temple, a public bathhouse, or an aqueduct. These acts of evergetism or civic benefaction were not charity. They were a brilliant political campaign. Your name would be inscribed on the building for all to see, permanently associating you with the public good and earning the loyalty of the local populace. This popularity could then be parlayed into political office. You might start by standing for the position of aedile, responsible for public games and festivals. Here, you could stage truly spectacular events, using your wealth to fund gladiatorial games, public feasts, and theatrical productions that dwarfed anything the old money aristocracy could afford. The roars of the crowd, cheering your name for the magnificent games you provided, were votes made audible. A successful term as aedile could propel you to the rank of equites, the equestrian order, and for the most ambitious and well-connected, even a seat in the Roman Senate was not out of reach. Your fortune, earned through global trade, had now purchased the highest honor Rome could bestow, a voice in ruling the empire itself. This transformation reshaped your very identity. You would commission a sculptor to create a realistic bust for your atrium, portraying you not in the practical tunic of a traveler, but in the thoughtful, draped toga of a statesman, your gaze turned inward toward Roman philosophy, not outward toward the sea. You might hire a tutor to teach your sons Greek rhetoric and Roman law, ensuring they entered public life with the education of a patrician, completely divorced from the grubby world of commerce that had funded it. Your daughter's dowry would be immense, allowing her to marry into an old, prestigious family, weaving your new bloodline into the ancient fabric of the Roman elite. The spice trade had been your vehicle, but the destination was always legitimacy. You were no longer the man who imported pepper. You were a Roman nobilis, your past adventures now merely a colorful story to be told over dinner, a testament to the incredible power of wealth to rewrite a destiny and build a legacy that would endure long after the last cent of cinnamon had faded from your warehouses. Despite the meticulous planning and immense investment, the specter of total failure loomed over every voyage, a chilling reality that even the most successful importers had to confront at least once in their careers. A single disastrous outcome could erase a lifetime of accumulated wealth and prestige, transforming a celebrated merchant into a bankrupt outcast overnight. The most common and devastating catastrophe was the complete loss of a ship. A vessel that failed to arrive at its scheduled port was typically presumed wrecked, a fate so common that maritime insurers in Alexandria calculated their premiums around an expected loss rate of 1 in every 5 ships. For the importer who had bet his entire fortune on that one vessel, the news was a death sentence for his business. There was no Coast Guard to mount a rescue, no satellite distress signal to pinpoint the location of the wreck. The sea simply swallowed the ship, the crew, and the cargo, leaving behind only silence and a cascade of financial ruin. The importer was still legally responsible for repaying his investors their initial capital, a debt that often forced him to liquidate his remaining assets, his home, his other ships, his land, plunging his family into penury and irrevocably shattering his hard-won reputation for reliability. Even if a ship miraculously returned, its cargo could be rendered worthless by the invisible enemy of spoilage. A slow voyage, an undetected leak, or a week of unseasonable humidity could ruin everything. Pepper, once it absorbed moisture, would clump together and ferment, developing a musty, foul odor that no amount of drying could ever rectify. A shipment of ginger could be discovered to be a writhing mass of insects upon opening the hold in Ostia. The most heartbreaking loss was saffron. Its delicate threads were incredibly susceptible to dampness, losing their vibrant color and potent aroma to become nothing more than a damp, brown, and utterly valueless mush. An importer facing such a scene on the docks was confronted with a special kind of agony. He had paid all the costs, the shipping, the duties, the bribes, for a hold full of garbage. There was no insurance claim for quality degradation. This cargo could not be sold at a discount. It had to be dumped into the sea to avoid contaminating his warehouse. A solemn, expensive funeral for a fortune that had physically returned, but was financially stillborn. Beyond the physical perils of the journey, the market itself could deliver a fatal blow. An importer could execute a flawless voyage, returning with a hold full of pristine, top-quality spices, only to discover that the bottom had fallen out of the market in his absence. A rival with deeper pockets might have just arrived with an unprecedented fleet, flooding the market with pepper and driving the price down to a fraction of its expected value. Worse yet, a political upheaval could make luxury goods suddenly unfashionable or even dangerous. A new, austere emperor might decry foreign luxuries as corrupting, or a civil war might disrupt the spending habits of the elite. The importer, having priced his cargo based on the market conditions of a year ago, would find himself unable to cover his immense costs, let alone turn a profit. He was a victim of economic forces he could neither predict nor control, his tangible treasures rendered almost worthless by the intangible shift of political winds and social tastes. Yet, the Roman world was not entirely without mechanisms for recovery, however harsh they might seem. The most common path for a failed importer was a form of structured bankruptcy. He would negotiate with his creditors, often his former investors and patrons, to settle his debts for a fraction of what was owed. This was not done out of kindness, but pragmatism. A destitute man could never repay anything, while a man left with some resources might eventually rebuild and become profitable again. These negotiations were humiliating and conducted under the watchful eye of a praetor, but they offered a sliver of hope. The failed importer might be forced to cede ownership of his remaining assets to his creditors, becoming the manager of his own former estate rather than its owner, working off his debt through years of servitude. For those with an unbroken spirit and a few remaining connections, the only path was to start over from the very bottom. A man who had once owned a fleet might take a job as a supercargo or a chief merchant on another man's ship, using his hard-earned expertise to guide someone else's venture in exchange for a share of the profits. This was a profound blow to his dignity, but it kept him in the game, allowing him to slowly accumulate new capital and knowledge. He would live not in a villa, but in a rented room near the docks, his world reduced once more to the essentials of survival and the dream of another chance. Every sestertius saved was a step toward leasing a small share in a single vessel, then perhaps owning a quarter of a ship, and slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding his network and his fortune over another decade of relentless work. The spice trade was a brutal teacher, but it always offered one more lesson in resilience, proving that a complete disaster was not always an ending, but sometimes just a brutally difficult new beginning. And so, the journey comes full circle from the sun-baked docks of Musaris to the marble halls of the Palatine Hill. You've navigated a path few could ever imagine. This wasn't merely a career, it was a metamorphosis. You began as a hopeful merchant with a ship and a dream, and through a combination of audacity, intellect, and sheer force of will, you transformed into an architect of taste, a financier of empires, and a silent partner in the very engine of Roman civilization. The spices you brought back did more than just season food. They seasoned an entire culture, defining luxury, enabling medicine, and fueling an economy of desire that stretched from the misty highlands of Scotland to the humid ports of southern India. Your legacy is etched not just in the coins you earned, but in the very fabric of daily Roman life, in the perfume of a patrician's banquet, in the incense of a temple ceremony, in the medicine that soothed a feverish child. You were a pioneer of globalization, a weaver of the first threads that connected East and West in a relentless, awe-inspiring pursuit of flavor. Now we turn the page over to you. As the scent of this story lingers, we want you to step into those worn sandals yourself. Look at the spices in your own kitchen, the pepper grinder, the jar of cinnamon, the saffron tucked away for a special occasion. Now, imagine a world where each of those tiny granules represented an epic saga of survival. Which one would have been worth the risk for you? Would you have braved the pirate-infested waters of the Red Sea for the fiery kick of Malabar black pepper? Would you have crossed the treacherous Indian Ocean to secure the sweet, woody bark of true cinnamon, knowing its source was guarded by fantastical legends? Or would the exquisite, heart-stopping value of saffron, each thread plucked by hand from 70,000 flowers, have been the siren's call that lured you in the trade? Tell us in the comments below which ancient spice would have been your personal quest for glory. And if you've enjoyed this journey into the perilous and profitable world of ancient commerce, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more adventures into the forgotten corners of history. Until next time, may your travels be safe and your spices ever potent.